So today's video I'm going to discuss about how to write a PhD dissertation. So now before we begin our discussion on this topic, let me give a few points about the difference between a master's thesis and a PhD dissertation. So just like I've explained in some previous videos, the thesis essentially means a certain statement which is proved in that particular document. So essentially in a master's thesis, you propose a thesis and you show its truth or its veracity. Now, in contrast to that, in a PhD dissertation, you start out with a thesis and then you subject this thesis to more levels of scrutiny and obtain feedback from people. So, you may actually perform a series of subtasks, and this essentially leads your thesis to be subjected to criticism, and also you are then expected to come up with a certain synthesis on the basic problem which you started with. And at the end of this synthesis, this entire process of thought is written out in the form of the PhD dissertation. So that's essentially the philosophy behind the PhD dissertation. And the expectation is that the PhD dissertation reveals that the candidate has put much more thought into the problem than in a master's thesis, and he or she has closed certain gaps which have come out in the process of looking into the problem. And so the advancement made in terms of research on that problem has been much more. So let us now go into the basic outline of a PhD thesis. So it essentially starts with the first page or the cover page, which is a title page, and in this you give your title at the top, and the title should be 12 words or less. Again, try to select a description which is quite descriptive of the work you have done in the thesis, but it's also catchy in terms of its usefulness as a marketing tool. So you should realize that the thesis title is the first sentence that would catch the eye of people to whom you go for jobs, postdocs, and so on. And therefore, you should put various important keywords which you want to publicize in this particular title. So if you are doing any work on an important field such as machine learning or smart structures or stochastic analysis, then make sure these particular keywords come into the thesis title. Now, at the bottom of this first page, you have the name of your institute or the university, and you may have some date at that point also as to where the thesis was written and exactly what is the date on which the thesis was written. So that is the first page. Now, following this, you may have a preface, and in this preface, typically people put out a few paragraphs. So I would suggest the first paragraph could be a description about how you landed up onto this problem and what motivated you to take up this particular problem. The second paragraph could be a description of some of the people who have helped you in this particular path, and you can thank the various people at this point, such as your supervisor, the committee members of your PhD, and also the various people in the labs and computer centers and so on. And also there is a good place to thank the colleagues in your lab who have helped you during this thesis. Now this preface is the first place and the last place where the people who examine the thesis see you as a person, so you can give various points about your being a real human being in this particular place. So next we come to an abstract, and again the abstract also should be a one-page document just like the preface. And the abstract, you essentially reply to three basic questions. The first question being, what did you do? The second question is, how did you do it? And the third question being, what are the major discoveries from your particular results? So sometimes this may go on to slightly more than one page, but I feel a good abstract is one page, and you should be able to limit your abstract to one page and make it a compendious document. So now once you are finished with this, you have a table of content, list of figures and list of tables. And these are created by LaTeX software in case you are using LaTeX for typesetting, which I would recommend that you do, because the thesis is a large document with a lot of references, figures and tables. And also it may have mathematical equations in the case of a scientific thesis. So it's very easy for LaTeX to put all these things together in a nice format. So now let's start with the first chapter, introduction. So as far as introduction is concerned, I would start with a very broad description of the problem. So let's say your broad topic is on smart structures. Then you could spend a few paragraphs on explaining the problems of smart structure at a very high level, such that a normal person in your field would understand what exactly you have done. So this person need not be an expert in the exact area, but a general expert in the field should be able to follow what is smart structure. And here you can drill down in a few paragraphs and bring to the particular problem which you are trying to do in the thesis. So let us, for concreteness, say that you are trying to solve a problem of fatigue behavior of piezo smart structures. Then that would be the particular problem you want to drill down in smart structure. You want to start with the basic importance of smart structure and the concept of smart structure. You can explain this with a diagram, and then you can look at some of the different type of materials which are used in smart structures. You can look at the piezo as one of the most practical material. Then you can point out the problems of fatigue and different type of damage in piezo structures. And then you can look at the particular problem which you are trying to solve, which is looking at the fatigue problems of piezo based smart structures. So that would probably take a page or two to describe, and here also you can give a few references to buttress your claim. Now once you have done this, you can start a formal literature survey, and in a literature survey you go in much more detail and look at various publications which have taken place in the field of smart structure, go through some of the important materials which have been used in the field, look at some of the prior literature which have been used in the subfields which you are looking at, for example the piezo ceramic materials here in the context of smart structure, as well as the fatigue problems. And especially when you are going deep into a problem like fatigue of smart structure, you must make sure you reference all the literature, and for each of the literature you can write several sentences or even paragraph for each particular paper which you cite at this point. So again, you are not constrained for space here, and you can take the number of pages you need and you can cite as many references as you want at this point, because the literature survey is one of the major contributions of a PhD thesis. Now once you have finished this particular literature survey, it's a good thing to have a section where you give the problem statement. So you can call this section as the problem statement, and here you essentially state out your problem very precisely which you are trying to address in this particular thesis. And then you can have one more section, outline of the thesis, and in this place you can give the titles and themes of all the rest of the chapters which are there in the thesis. So now your introduction chapter is finished and you move to the next chapter. So this is typically a methods chapter, and in this chapter you can give your mathematical and computational model. If you have done experiments, you can give the whole experimental setup at this point. And if you have done various statistical analysis, you can discuss this particular statistical analysis theory at this point. Now following this methods chapter, you may have up to 3 chapters or even 4 which are essentially results type of chapters. So here, for example, let us look at this particular problem you are doing, which is the piezo fatigue problem. So chapter 3 could be your piezo structure high cycle fatigue modeling. Chapter 4 could be piezo structure low cycle fatigue modeling. And chapter 5 could be experiments you have performed on this piezo structure for both these situations. So these chapters may involve presentation of certain theory which you have developed, running of various numerical simulations which you have done, and you can at that point also present various graphs and tables which you have obtained on this particular problem. and the discussions related to these graphs and table. So this is the main body of the thesis, and in this particular place you give out the complete outline of the entire problem, and all your discussions should be such that they lead to the final conclusions of the thesis, which in turn feed into the major discoveries of the thesis. So once these particular results chapters have been finished, you have a chapter on conclusions. And in the conclusions chapter, I would suggest in the first paragraph of this chapter, you essentially summarize the entire thesis. So there may be people who are reading your conclusion section without necessarily reading the complete thesis. So here a paragraph or two could be there which essentially summarizes the entire work of the thesis. Then you list out all the key conclusions which have come out from the thesis. And these conclusions would typically be coming out from the results chapter, and there may be some comments about any particular derivation you have done or new experimental setup you have created, which may come out from the methods chapter. But essentially the conclusions chapter should be such that somebody can read it by without referring to the material in the previous chapters. So once your conclusion is done, you should also have a final section in the conclusion which you can call future work. So here you can bring out some of the problems which you plan to address in future work, and this is not only a good place to suggest problems for further researchers, but also a good place to essentially point out problems which you have not solved in the thesis. So maybe there are certain experiments which you did not do because of paucity of time, and you felt that, and your supervisor felt that your problem has been more or less finished and somebody else can take that problem further on. So it's a good point to put all these particular problems in the future work section so that these problems or concepts are not lost. Following this, you have a reference section, or it's called a bibliography. And here essentially you give out all the references in the thesis. So you may have 70 to 150 references. Again, it's important to follow the same style for all these particular references and to ensure that you have cited all these references in your thesis. So essentially now you will realize that the thesis is a document which is sandwiched between starting section and the conclusion section. So and most of the chapters inside this thesis are based on the methods and the result section. So this is what essentially creates a thesis. Now again, to discuss some of the points which I have mentioned before, make sure it is in 12-point font, and don't bother so much about the size because this is a PDF file. Also make it 1.5 spacing or double point spacing. And a typical thesis would be about 100 to 200 pages in this kind of format. It may be less if you have used a lot of math, if your work is of a different type where you have more mathematics or derivations or experiment and less of results. So again, that is a very field dependent situation which you may have. And the important thing to keep in mind is that when you write a thesis, it's probably simpler to write a thesis if you have published a few papers in the past, because then you can collate some of the work into a LaTeX thesis, and you can also use the LaTeX documents which you have obtained from your previous work and put it all together. That's one model of writing the thesis. Second model is to complete all the work, write the thesis, and then to extract papers out of this. So again, both these models are completely legitimate ways of doing this problem, and you can use whichever model suits your PhD guide and your department or university. So these are some of the main thoughts I had today about the process of writing a PhD thesis, and I hope this was useful to you. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in my next video.